She threw him out of the car on the way to his father's funeral. Not metaphorically, not in an argument that spilled into the parking lot. She pulled to the shoulder of a Houston highway, reached across the center console, and opened his door. He was wearing his funeral suit. He was holding the program he had stayed up the night before, carefully folding. And she drove away and left him standing there, alone, on the side of the road, on the worst morning of his life, because she had somewhere more important to be. What she did not know, what she could not have imagined in her most careful calculations, was that the man she put out of that car was the sole heir to one of the largest private fortunes ever assembled in silence, and that her family's empire, every location, every luncheon, every charity gala, every moment they had spent telling him he was lucky to be in the room, had been running for years on his father's money. She did not know who she married, but she was about to find out. Before we go any further, if you're already feeling something, go ahead and tap that like button right now. And if you are new here, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And drop your city in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are watching from today. This community is worldwide, and I want to hear from you. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started. To a Tuesday morning in Houston, to a man in a funeral suit, and to the moment a door opened that should never have been touched. Calvin Reeves had been awake since 4 in the morning. He had not slept much anyway. He lay in the dark on his side of the bed, listening to the ceiling fan turn, thinking about his father the way you think about someone when you are still adjusting to the fact that they are gone, in pieces, in flashes, in the smell of the old man's aftershave and the sound of his laugh and the way he used to tap the table twice with 2 fingers when he was making a point he considered settled. He got up quietly, ironed his suit in the hallway so the light would not wake Simone, and was dressed by 6:15. The suit was charcoal grey. Henry Reeves had told him once that a man buries his people in charcoal grey, not black. Black is for strangers, he said. Grey is for someone you loved. Calvin had remembered that. He was standing at the kitchen counter drinking coffee when Simone came downstairs at 7, already in her robe, already with her phone in her hand. She looked at him in his suit and said, almost to herself, that she needed to talk to him about the luncheon. Calvin set his cup down. Bernard was staying with them for the week. He appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later in his pajamas, a large man with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never needed to be anywhere before he was ready. He poured himself coffee without asking and leaned against the counter like it was his own house. Simone explained, without quite looking at Calvin, that the Beaumont Foundation luncheon had moved. A venue conflict. She was going to need to leave the service early, right after the burial, before the repast. She said it the way she said most things that were not really requests, as information already decided, delivered as a courtesy. Calvin asked her, once and quietly, to stay through the repast. His father's people would be there. It would mean something. Bernard set down his cup and said, with that wide, easy smile of his, that Calvin couldn't ask a woman to choose between her obligations. He said it like he was doing Calvin a favor by explaining how the world worked. Calvin did not respond to Bernard. He picked up his keys. Simone drove. She had insisted on that too. They were on Highway 288, 12 minutes from the church, when her phone rang through the Bluetooth. She answered before Calvin could register what was happening. It was Gloria. There was a problem with the caterer. Something about the seating count. Simona's voice shifted into the register she used for foundation business. Clipped, efficient, in charge. And she made a clean U-turn at the next light without a word to Calvin. He said her name. Then he said simply his father's name. She said she would drop him. He told her they were close. He asked her to stay. Just the service. Just sit beside him for 1 hour in the church where his father's body was lying in a box at the front of the room. Simone pulled to the shoulder of Highway 288. She reached across the center console with her right hand, and she opened his door. She did not look at him when she did it. She was already looking at the road, already calculating the route back. She said she did not have time for this today. She said his name. She said, "Get out." Calvin Reeves picked up the small bag at his feet, stepped out of his wife's white Range Rover, and stood on the shoulder of a Houston highway in his charcoal grey suit while she pulled back into traffic like he had been a parcel she had been asked to deliver and had simply changed her mind about. He watched her tail lights until they were gone. He stood there for a moment that had no name for it. Then he took out his phone and opened a ride-share app. Before the app loaded, a pickup truck slowed beside him. The driver was an older man, grey at the temples, work-worn hands on the wheel. He looked at Calvin standing there in that suit with that bag, and he read the whole situation without asking a single question about it. He just asked where Calvin was headed. Calvin told him 3rd Ward Missionary Baptist. The man nodded once. He said, "Get in." They rode in silence for 11 minutes. The older man had gospel radio, low on the dial. Calvin watched Houston pass outside the window and did not say anything and did not need to. He arrived 4 minutes before the service began. He walked into 3rd Ward Missionary Baptist Church and sat in the front pew. Alone. He placed his bag beside his feet and held the printed program with both hands and read his father's name at the top of it. Henry Arthur Reeves, beloved father, known to many. The church was full. Calvin had not expected that. People filled every pew, spilled into the side aisles, stood along the back wall. Men his father's age in their good suits, women from the neighborhood. Younger faces Calvin did not recognize at all. His father apparently had been known to many more people than Calvin had understood. The eulogy was given by Pastor Gideon, who had known Henry Reeves for 30 years, and who said that Henry was a man who never told you what he had, but always showed you what he was made of. Calvin's phone buzzed against his thigh during the eulogy. He looked down once. A text from Simone. "We need to talk about the future of this marriage when you get back." He turned his phone face down on his knee, and he did not look at it again. After the burial, there was a repast in the church fellowship hall. People brought food the way 3rd Ward people bring food. Serious quantities, serious care. Pans of baked chicken and pots of greens, and a sweet potato pie on the end table that someone had clearly been up since 5 in the morning making. Calvin was moving through the room, accepting handshakes and condolences he could barely hear, when the funeral director touched his elbow and handed him a sealed envelope. He said it was from the estate. "Standard procedure," he said, "for the primary beneficiary." Calvin tucked it under his arm. 3 men approached him before he could open it. They were not church people. They wore dark suits that were not bought off any rack, and they moved through the fellowship hall with the kind of quiet authority that does not announce itself. They shook his hand in sequence, and the one in front told Calvin that they were the attorneys for his father's estate. He said when Calvin was ready, he should call. They left a single card, passed hand to hand, until it reached Calvin's. He looked at the card. He looked up. They were already moving toward the door. Calvin put the card in his breast pocket and finished the repast and drove himself home. That night he hung his suit on the back of the bedroom door. The card fell from the breast pocket and landed face up on the hardwood floor. He stood there looking at it for a moment before he picked it up and set it on the nightstand. He got into bed. The house was quiet. Simone had not come home yet. Calvin lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about his father and about strangers who stop on the side of roads without being asked, and about a card sitting on a nightstand that he could not stop thinking about, and about the specific sound of a car door being opened from the inside while a man is still sitting in it. He did not sleep for a long time. The card sat on the nightstand for 3 days. Calvin looked at it every morning when he woke up and every night before he turned out the light. He did not pick it up. He was not ready. There was still grief to move through first, and grief, Calvin had learned, did not negotiate with schedules or convenience. It arrived when it arrived, and it asked for what it asked for, and the only thing a man could do was be present for it. He went back to work on Thursday, opened the shop at 7, same as always. His foreman, a steady man named Terence, did not make a fuss about it. Just handed Calvin a coffee and walked him through the week's jobs. That was the right thing to do, and Terence knew it. But to understand that card on the nightstand and what it would eventually mean, you had to go back further. You had to go back 7 years to when Calvin Reeves was 34 years old and had just married the most beautiful woman he had ever known and believed, with the particular sincerity of a man who has earned everything he has, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Calvin grew up in 3rd Ward. Not the gentrified edges of it, but the deep interior, where the houses were small and well kept, and people left their porch lights on for each other. His mother worked dispatch for a trucking company. His father, Henry, worked what appeared to be a series of modest consulting contracts that kept the household comfortable, but never flashy. Calvin learned to work young, the way 3rd Ward boys learn. Not because anyone lectured him about it, but because the adults around him simply worked, and he absorbed it like weather. He started Reeves Heating, Air and Mechanical at 28 with 1 van, a used set of tools and 3 commercial contracts he had spent a year cultivating. By 32, he had 6 employees. By 34, he had 8, a small office off Almeida, and a reputation in the 3rd Ward business community for showing up exactly when he said he would and never padding an invoice. That was the year he met Simone Beaumont at a mutual friend's cookout in Pearland. She was sharp and funny and wore a white sundress and laughed at something Calvin said before he had finished saying it, which he took as a sign. He was right for a while. The early years were real. Simone was drawn to Calvin's steadiness in a way she was not entirely self-aware about. He was the first man she had been with who did not perform, who did not need the room's attention, who simply was what he was at a consistent and reliable temperature. She told her cousin Renee in those first years that Calvin made her feel settled. They married 18 months after that cookout. Henry Reeves sat in the front row at the ceremony looking quietly pleased, the way he looked when something confirmed what he already believed. The change did not happen at once. It never does. Simone was promoted to Director of Development at the Beaumont Foundation 2 years into the marriage, and almost immediately began moving in rooms that operated by rules Calvin had not been taught and did not particularly want to learn. Fundraising galas, board dinners, events where the parking valets wore better shoes than Calvin owned. She did not ask him not to come. She simply began preparing him in advance, the way you prepare someone for a place that will not be easy for them, straightening his tie a moment too long, suggesting gently that he let her do most of the talking tonight. Bernard Beaumont was the one who formalized it. The first time Bernard said it, Calvin thought he had misheard. They were at a family dinner at the Beaumont house in Sugar Land, a large stone house with a water feature in the entryway that Calvin had always found faintly absurd, and Bernard had clapped him on the shoulder with one of those big hands of his, and said in front of 4 other people that Calvin was a lucky man, that not many women like Simone chose men like Calvin, and he ought to remember that. He said it with a smile. He always said it with a smile. That was the point. Calvin said nothing. He picked up his fork and finished his food. Gloria Beaumont's version was quieter and, in some ways, more precise. She began treating Calvin as an extension of the household staff at family events, asking him to carry things, to check on the cars, to see if the caterers needed anything, with the serene confidence of a woman who had simply assessed the hierarchy and was acting accordingly. She never said anything overtly cruel. She did not need to. Henry was always present at these gatherings. He was always warm and always appropriate and always watching. Calvin noticed early on that his father would watch Bernard Beaumont with an expression that Calvin could never fully read, not quite contempt, not quite amusement. Something between the two that required a kind of patience to maintain. Henry never said a word about the Beaumonts. Not once. Simona stopped correcting her family somewhere in year 4. It did not happen in a single moment Calvin could point to. He simply realized one evening, driving home from a dinner where Bernard had delivered his standard line to a table of 8, that Simone had laughed along with the rest of them. She had not always laughed. Calvin noted it the way he noted most things, completely and quietly, filing it in a place he did not visit often, but never forgot. He drove home. He went to work the next morning. He hired his 11th employee that spring and his 12th that fall. The business grew. His marriage hollowed out, slow and steady, like something being carved from the inside by a tool too small to see. The last 2 years of Calvin's marriage did not deteriorate so much as calcify. The Beaumonts had always been arrogant, but arrogance, Calvin had observed, tends to expand when it goes unchallenged, and by the time the Beaumont Family Dentistry Group announced its 23-location expansion in the spring, the family's sense of their own importance had grown into something that filled every room they entered and left no space for anyone they deemed beneath consideration. The announcement came with a press release and a celebration dinner at a private room inside a downtown Houston restaurant that Calvin had to look up to find out how to dress for. The Houston Business Journal ran a half-page feature on Bernard Beaumont, patriarch and founder, visionary, and pillar of the Houston business community. The article named Gloria. It named Simone, describing her as integral to the Beaumont Foundation's growth. It named the company's CFO and its lead banker. It did not name Calvin. He had attended every planning dinner for 2 years. He had driven Simone to every one of them. He had sat at those tables and listened and asked questions that he thought were useful and said nothing when his questions went unanswered. He read the article once and set it down and did not mention it to anyone. Bernard was insufferable in the weeks after the announcement. He moved through family gatherings like a man who had recently been confirmed as correct about everything, which, in his view, he had been. He began pulling Simone aside at family dinners to discuss what he called her options, her future, her trajectory, what a woman of her capability deserved in terms of a life partner. He did not lower his voice when he said these things. He was not performing discretion. He wanted Calvin to hear. Calvin heard. He ate his food. He passed the rolls when asked. He thanked Gloria when she refilled his water glass, which she did the way she did most things for Calvin, with the brisk efficiency of someone tending to a task rather than a person. It was at one of those dinners, a Sunday meal at the Sugarland House, when Gloria said it. She was talking to a cousin named Phyllis who had driven in from Beaumont, and they were standing near the kitchen doorway while Calvin sat at the dining table, close enough to hear every word without needing to try. Gloria was describing Simone's life in the appreciative tones of a woman cataloguing an inventory, the position, the social connections, the trajectory of the Beaumont name. And then, gesturing vaguely in Calvin's direction, she said that Simone's husband was adequate, or that was the word, adequate, said as assessment, not insult, which somehow made it worse. Calvin looked at Simone across the table. Simone was looking at her plate. She did not look up. She did not correct her mother. She smoothed the napkin in her lap and reached for her glass and took a slow, unhurried sip, and Calvin understood in that moment, with a clarity that settled into him like something cooling and permanent, that Simone's silence was not discomfort. It was agreement. He drove home that night with the radio off. He thought about his father. Calvin had been visiting Henry more frequently over the past year, finding reasons to stop by the old house on Holman Street on weekday evenings. A plumbing question he needed advice on, a work decision, sometimes nothing specific at all. Henry always had the radio on, always had something on the stove. He never asked why Calvin was coming by more often. He simply made room. Henry never said a word against Simone, not once. What he did in those visits was ask Calvin questions. What kind of work was he most proud of this year? What he wanted the business to be in 5 years? What kind of man he wanted his employees to remember him as? Questions that pulled Calvin back toward the center of himself, toward something solid every time he felt the ground getting soft. Calvin noticed that winter that his father was moving more carefully, slower on the stairs, taking longer to rise from his chair. When Calvin mentioned it, Henry waved it off, said his knees were acting up, said it was nothing, it was not nothing. Henry was admitted to Memorial Hermann in February for what his doctors called a cardiac event that required monitoring and adjustment of his medications. He was there for 4 days. Calvin came every day. He sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, and they watched the evening news and talked about the rockets, and ate the hospital food without complaining, the way men who grew up without options learn not to complain about inconveniences. Simone did not visit. She had the foundation's spring gala to organize. She said she would try to get by if things opened up. Things did not open up. Calvin filed that too. Henry came home in good spirits, insisting he was fine, insisting Calvin stop hovering. Calvin tried. He called every other day instead of stopping by. Henry sounded like himself on the phone, warm, unhurried, asking the same kinds of questions. Then one Tuesday evening, the week before everything changed, Henry called Calvin while Calvin was still at the shop finishing paperwork. It was just past 7. The office was quiet. Calvin answered on the second ring. Henry did not say much. He asked how the business was. He said he was proud, and then, near the end of the call, in a tone that was not alarming but was somehow different, more deliberate, more settled, he said, "The lawyers know, son," he said, "live your life real." Calvin asked him what he meant. Henry said he would understand when it mattered. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular. Calvin told his father he loved him. Henry said the same. Calvin hung up and sat at his desk for a moment, and then gathered his things and drove home. Henry Reeves died on a Wednesday morning, 6 days later. Calvin was in his work truck on the way to a job in Pasadena when his phone rang. He pulled into a gas station parking lot to take the call. He sat there for a long time after it ended, engine running, watching the traffic move on the road in front of him. He was still sitting there when he remembered the card. He called on a Thursday morning. 3 days after the funeral, 2 days after he had gone back to work, 1 day after he had sat in the parking lot of a Whataburger on Alameda eating lunch alone, and realized he had not spoken a full sentence to another human being since the repast. He found the card on his nightstand where he had left it, picked it up without deliberating any further, and dialed before he could talk himself into waiting longer. The receptionist answered on the second ring. When Calvin gave his name, something in her voice shifted almost imperceptibly, slight increase in attention, a small recalibration of tone. She asked him to hold for just one moment. He was not on hold for long. Marcus Whitfield himself came on the line. He said they had been expecting Calvin's call. He asked if Calvin could come in that morning. Calvin looked down at his work clothes, his standard Reeves HVAC shirt, dark canvas pants, boots he had resoled twice because they still had good life in them. He asked if he needed to change. Whitfield said no. He said to come as he was. The offices of Whitfield Cross and Moorhead occupied the 14th floor of a downtown building on Louisiana Street, the kind of building with a lobby that echoed and art on the walls that nobody had chosen for decoration. Calvin rode the elevator up and stepped out into a reception area that was all dark wood and deliberate quiet. The receptionist rose when she saw him, which was not something receptionists had ever done for Calvin before. She said Mr. Whitfield was ready for him and led him down a hallway without being asked. There were 3 attorneys in the conference room. Whitfield sat at the head of the table. A composed man in his mid-50s, dark suit, silver at his temples, hands folded in front of him with the stillness of someone who had delivered consequential news many times and understood the value of not rushing it. The other 2 sat to either side with legal pads and open folders. Calvin took the seat across from Whitfield and set his phone face down on the table and waited. Whitfield thanked him for coming. He said he had been Henry Reeves's primary attorney for 15 years. He said Henry was one of the most deliberate and clear-eyed men he had ever worked with, and that everything Calvin was about to hear was the direct result of decisions Henry had made carefully over decades with full legal intention. Then he began. Henry Reeves had spent 40 years quietly building a private equity firm called Reeves Capital Partners, not a small firm, not a regional fund, a firm with $1.7 trillion in assets under management, structured across 17 separate shell entities in 4 states, Texas, Delaware, Nevada, and Georgia, specifically designed to preserve anonymity and protect the principal's identity from public disclosure. The structure was not evasion, it was architecture. Every entity was legally sound, every filing current, every audit clean. Henry had simply built a wall of corporate distance between his name and his money because he believed, without apology, that visible wealth changed the people around you in ways that could not be undone. Calvin asked Whitfield to repeat the number. Whitfield repeated it without inflection. $1.7 trillion in managed assets. He slid the portfolio summary across the table. Calvin looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Whitfield continued. Henry had also established a separate liquid trust, $340 million in cash-equivalent assets, held outside the firm's structure. The trust had a single beneficiary. It had a single activation condition, the filing of Henry Reeves's death certificate with Harris County. That filing had been completed automatically by the estate 2 days ago. The trust was already active. The funds were already in Calvin's name. Calvin put the portfolio summary down on the table and sat back in his chair. Whitfield gave him a moment. Then he said there was one more thing Calvin needed to understand about how the firm operated. Every significant loan in Reeves Capital's portfolio contained what was called a change of control clause. Standard language, Whitfield explained, in any institutional lending agreement of this size. If the controlling interest of the fund changed hands, all loan counterparties were to be notified, and the new principal had 90 days to elect whether to waive the clause or exercise the right to call the outstanding note. Calvin asked how many loans that affected. Whitfield said 43 active agreements across the portfolio. Then he opened a separate folder, thinner than the others, and set it on the table between them. He said there was one loan in particular that Calvin would want to review before making any decisions. The folder contained the Beaumont Family Dentistry Group loan agreement, $34 million outstanding, mezzanine position, originated in 2019 to fund the family's 23-location expansion. Personal guarantees signed by Bernard Beaumont and Gloria Beaumont, individually, against their personal assets. The fund that held the loan was a Reeves Capital subsidiary called Horizon Credit Partners, Calvin's father's fund. Calvin stared at the name at the top of the page. He read it twice. Then he looked up at Whitfield. Whitfield said the Beaumonts had been making loan payments to Horizon Credit Partners for 6 years without knowing who ultimately owned the fund. He said that was entirely legal and entirely common in private equity structures. He said Calvin now held the controlling interest. The room was quiet. Calvin asked one question. He asked what happened to the Beaumonts if he chose not to waive the change of control clause. Whitfield explained precisely and without editorializing. The note would be called, the Beaumonts would have 90 days to refinance $34 million or begin liquidating assets to cover the balance. Their personal guarantees meant their individual holdings were exposed. Given their current leverage position, which Whitfield had reviewed, refinancing at market rates would be extremely difficult. Calvin nodded once. He thanked the attorneys, shook 3 hands, and rode the elevator back down to the lobby. He drove home in his work truck through afternoon Houston traffic with the radio off, the same way he had driven home from every Beaumont family dinner for 7 years. He pulled into his driveway and sat there for 20 minutes, watching the sun move across the front of his house. Then he went inside and cooked dinner. Chicken thighs, rice, the last of the greens his neighbor Miss Adele had sent over after the funeral. He ate alone at the kitchen table, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, his hands were completely still. He slept on it for 1 week, not because he was uncertain. Calvin had been certain from the moment he looked up from that loan document and saw his father's fund name printed at the top of the page. He slept on it because he was the kind of man who did not move on big decisions until he had sat with them long enough to make sure the decision was clean, not emotional, not reactive, not something he would need to revisit. He wanted to be sure that when he moved once. On the 8th day, he picked up his phone at 6:45 in the morning, still in his work clothes, standing in his kitchen with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched yet. He dialed Whitfield's direct line. Whitfield answered on the second ring. Calvin said 3 words. He said, "Don't waive it." Then he said he would come in that afternoon to sign whatever needed signing, and he ended the call. He finished his coffee. He opened the shop at 7, same as always. The meeting with Whitfield that afternoon was different from the first one. The first meeting had been about information. This one was about sequence. Whitfield had his team assembled. 2 associates and the firm's general counsel, a sharp and economical woman named Patricia Okafor, who spoke the way a scalpel moves, precisely, without waste. They walked Calvin through the full architecture of what was about to happen. The change of control notices would go out to all 43 loan counterparties simultaneously. Simultaneously was the word Whitfield used, and he used it deliberately because it mattered. No single notice would arrive before another. Every affected party would receive their document on the same day, from the same certified mail batch with the same effective date. Among those 43 counterparties, the Beaumont Family Dentistry Group would receive theirs on a Monday morning, no different from a regional grocery chain in Galveston or a commercial developer in San Antonio, just another letter in just another stack. That was the elegance of it. The Beaumonts would have no warning and no advantage. Patricia Okafor then laid out the divorce filing. Calvin had not raised the subject. She raised it because she had reviewed the marital asset situation and understood that timing was everything. Calvin needed to file first. If Simone filed first and positioned herself as the initiating party, her attorneys could front-load the asset claims and spend weeks establishing a narrative around Calvin's apparent means. If Calvin filed first, quietly and without announcement, the posture of the proceedings reversed before she had time to build one. The divorce petition would be filed at the Harris County Courthouse on the same day the certified mail left the facility. Different mechanisms, same Friday. The clock on both would begin at precisely the same moment. Calvin asked Patricia what Simone's attorneys would see when the asset disclosure arrived. Patricia said they would see everything, every account, every entity, every dollar, and next to each item they would see its origin, which fund it came from, which entity held it, and who controlled that entity. She said that in her experience, when a spouse's legal team opens a document like that and sees those numbers, the conversation changes within 48 hours. Calvin nodded. He signed where they indicated. Then Whitfield gave him one instruction that Calvin did not need to be told twice. He said Calvin was to make no visible changes to his daily life. No new car, no different clothes, no shift in routine that Simone might notice and bring to her attorney as evidence of changed circumstances. He was to wake up at the same time, drive the same truck, open the shop at the same hour, say good morning to his wife the same way he always had. Calvin said that would not be difficult. He drove home that evening the same way he always drove home. Simone was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a glass of wine, working on seating arrangements for the Beaumont Foundation's fall gala. She did not look up when he came in. He said good evening. She said something about the caterer without looking at him. He went upstairs, washed his hands, and came back down to make dinner. She was on the phone with Gloria by the time the food was ready. He ate alone at the counter, which had become the standard arrangement, and when he was done he cleaned up and went upstairs and set his alarm for 5:45. The following Friday Calvin left the shop at noon and drove to Riverside National Cemetery, where Henry Reeves had been buried 11 days earlier. He parked on the cemetery road and walked to the grave, which still had fresh flowers someone from the church had placed there. He stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets and his truck keys in his right fist. He stood there for a while. He did not say anything out loud. He did not need to. Some conversations happen entirely in the interior between a son and a father who taught him what real quiet looks like. Not the quiet of a man who has nothing to say, but the quiet of a man who knows exactly when to speak. Calvin drove back to the shop and finished out the day. At 4:47 that afternoon, a postal worker loaded a tray of certified mail envelopes into a processing cart at the main Houston distribution facility on Telephone Road. 43 envelopes. The Beaumont Family Dentistry Group's was the 14th in the stack. It looked no different from any of the others. The clock was running. Monday was coming. The envelope arrived on a Monday. The Beaumont Group's CFO, a precise and careful man named Ronald Tate, opened his certified mail at 8:15 in the morning, the way he opened everything, methodically, without urgency. He read the change of control notice twice. Then he sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Bernard Beaumont. Bernard did not believe it. He said there had to be a mistake. He said Horizon Credit Partners was a small fund, a regional outfit, and whoever was sending legal notices on their behalf clearly did not understand who they were dealing with. He told Ronald to call their attorney and get it sorted out by end of day. The attorney called back in 2 hours. There was no mistake. The change of control was legally executed, properly filed, and fully enforceable. The personal guarantees Bernard and Gloria had signed in 2019 were binding. If the note was called and the Beaumont Group could not refinance or cover the balance, their individual assets, the Sugarland house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, were all exposed. Bernard called 3 banks in the first week. The first bank's commercial lending officer was polite and thorough and ultimately declined. "Too much existing leverage," she said. The second bank took 10 days and came back with the same answer in writing. The third bank, a regional lender Bernard had done business with for 15 years, declined within 48 hours. Their relationship manager said he was sorry and that he hoped Bernard understood the market conditions. Bernard did not understand. Bernard raged. He called an emergency family meeting at the Sugarland house on a Sunday evening. Gloria sat at the dining room table with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Bernard stood at the head of the table, voice filling the room, demanding explanations from people who had none to give. And then Simone asked the question that had been building in her chest since the first phone call from Ronald. She asked who owned Horizon Credit Partners now. Bernard told her. The silence that followed was like something falling from a very great height. Simone said Calvin's name, the way you say the name of something you cannot fully comprehend yet, quietly, almost to herself. Bernard told her to stop saying it like that and start thinking about solutions. Gloria wept into her handkerchief. Nobody had solutions. The 90-day clock did not care about any of it. The distressed sale began in week 7. The Beaumont Group's broker, a man they had used for acquisitions, never dispositions, quietly began marketing 7 of the 23 locations. The prices were not good. Distressed sellers in a buyer's market rarely get good prices. They sold anyway because the alternative was worse. On a Thursday morning, the Houston Business Journal ran the story. The headline read, "Beaumont Dental Group sells off locations amid financing pressure." The article ran 4 paragraphs. It named the 7 locations. It cited unnamed sources familiar with the transaction. It was factual and without editorial comment, which somehow made it more devastating than if it had been cruel. Simone saw it at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning. Her phone rang 12 minutes later. It did not stop for the rest of the day. Gala committee colleagues, women from the charity circuit who expressed concern in the specific performative way of people who are gathering information rather than offering comfort. One woman left a voicemail that began with the words, "I just want to make sure you're okay," and contained 3 pointed questions disguised as kindness. Invitations that had been forthcoming went quiet. A planning meeting Simone had been included in for 2 years suddenly had a scheduling conflict she was not notified about. The social collapse was not dramatic, it was surgical. It was the sound of phones not ringing. Then the divorce attorney called. His name was Garrett, and he had opened the proceedings 6 weeks earlier with the confident posture of a man who believed he held all the leverage. He had filed maximalist demands. He had used the word modest in reference to Calvin's apparent assets at least 4 times in their first meeting. Now he called Simone and asked her to come in as soon as possible. The letter from Reeves Capital's general counsel had arrived at his office that morning. It was 41 pages. It catalogued every marital asset by name, account number, entity, and origin. Next to each item was a notation, which Reeves Capital's subsidiary fund the asset derived from, directly or indirectly, and when the connection was established. Garrett told Simone the posture of the proceedings needed to change. She asked what that meant. He told her what it meant. That same week, Bernard called Calvin's cell phone on a Wednesday afternoon. Calvin was at his desk reviewing a commercial bid when the call came through. He looked at the name on the screen. He set the phone back down and let it ring out. A few minutes later, the voicemail notification appeared. He played it once, Bernard's voice stripped of its usual baritone confidence, smaller than Calvin had ever heard it, asking Calvin to call him back, saying they needed to talk like men, saying there must be some kind of misunderstanding here. Calvin deleted it. The following Thursday, Gloria Beaumont walked into Calvin's shop on Alameda at 11 in the morning. His office manager, a steady woman named Josephine, came to his office door and said there was a woman out front asking for him. Josephine described her. Calvin said he was on a job site. Josephine said yes, sir, without blinking, and went back to deliver the message. Calvin sat in his office 10 feet from the front desk and finished reviewing the bid. Later that afternoon, he picked up his phone and read the Houston Business Journal headline one more time. He set the phone face down on his desk. He pulled the bid back toward him and picked up his pen. When Simone texted that evening asking if they could meet, he replied with one word. He named the location. Calvin chose the church on purpose. He did not suggest a restaurant or a lawyer's conference room, or the house they had shared for 7 years. He texted Simone one address, 3rd Ward Missionary Baptist Church on Holman Street, and he offered no explanation. She had asked for a meeting. He had named the terms. If she wanted to understand why he chose it, she could walk through the same door his father's casket had come through and think about what she had chosen not to do that morning. He arrived at 8:15. The church was empty on a Saturday, the sanctuary quiet in the particular way of rooms that absorb a great deal of human feeling and hold it in the walls. Pastor Gideon had given Calvin a key the week after the funeral, told him to use the space whenever he needed it. Calvin had called ahead. The sanctuary was unlocked and the lights were on, and Calvin sat in the front pew, the same pew where he had sat alone while his father was eulogized and his phone buzzed against his knee. And he waited. He did not have to wait long. The doors opened at 8:35. Simone came in first. She was dressed carefully, the way she dressed for things that mattered to her image, and her face was composed in the way of someone who had rehearsed composure and was now deploying it. Bernard came in behind her, filling the doorway with his size and his remaining authority. He looked like a man who still believed that presence was power, and that if he stood tall enough in a room, the room would accommodate him. Calvin did not rise. He sat with his hands folded loosely in front of him and watched them come down the center aisle. Bernard opened his mouth when he reached the front of the sanctuary, something assembling itself on his face that resembled the beginning of a speech. Calvin raised his right hand, palm out, without looking at Bernard directly. Bernard stopped. Something in the stillness of that gesture, the absolute absence of aggression in it, the total certainty, stopped Bernard Beaumont in a way that volume never could have. He stood there, hand half raised himself, and then lowered it. And then he sat in the pew across the aisle without another word, like a man who has suddenly understood that the room belongs to someone else. Calvin looked at Simone. Only at Simona. He spoke quietly and without hurry, the way he did everything that mattered. He said he wanted to start with Highway 288. He said he wanted her to remember that morning clearly because he had not forgotten a single detail of it. The call coming through the Bluetooth, the U-turn at the light, the way she had said she would drop him without looking at him when she said it. He said he remembered the feel of the door handle moving under her hand. He said he had stood on the shoulder of that highway in his father's funeral suit and watched her merge back into traffic, and he had not called her back. He said he wanted her to understand why he had not called her back. Not because he was too proud, not because he was too hurt, because he already knew in that moment exactly what kind of woman he had married and exactly what that meant. He had known it for a while. Highway 288 was just the day it was said out loud in a language that could not be misunderstood. Simona's composure held, but only in form. Something behind her eyes was moving. Calvin said he also remembered the text. He said he had been sitting in this exact pew, holding the program with his father's name on the front when his phone buzzed. He said he had read it and turned it face down, and that for the rest of the service he had thought about what kind of woman sends that particular text to a man sitting alone at his father's funeral. He said he had arrived at a clear answer. He let that sit. Then he said he wanted to tell her something about his father. He said that Henry Reeves had sat at every Beaumont event for 7 years. He had sat at those tables in his good clothes and eaten the food and listened to Bernard's speeches and watched Gloria move through rooms like she owned every surface in them. He had done all of that without saying a single word to Calvin about what he was watching. Calvin paused. He said his father had spent 40 years building something called Reeves Capital Partners. He said the firm managed $1.7 trillion in assets, structured through 17 companies across 4 states, and that every single one of those entities traced back, in the end, to a man from 3rd Ward, Houston, who grew up without enough to eat and chose to spend his life invisible. Simone's breath changed. Calvin watched her face move through disbelief and then through the rapid, cold mathematics of calculation, and then through something he had never seen on her face before in 7 years, something unguarded and unperformed and almost frightened. He said there was one more thing. He said that in 2019, when the Beaumont Family Dentistry Group financed its 23-location expansion, it borrowed $34 million from a fund called Horizon Credit Partners. He said Horizon Credit Partners was a Reeves Capital subsidiary. He said his father's money had funded the expansion that put the Beaumont name in the Houston Business Journal. He said that for 6 years, every loan payment the Beaumont Group made had been going, indirectly, to Henry Reeves. He said every gala, every luncheon, every time your daddy told me I was lucky. Then he said it plainly and completely, the way his father had taught him to say things that needed to be said without decoration. He said, "You pulled over on Highway 288 and opened my door because you didn't have time for my father's funeral. Your family built their empire on my father's money. Every location, every luncheon, every time your daddy told me I was lucky. All of it running on Reeves Capital. All of it running on us." The sanctuary held the words. Simone reached across the pew and put her hand on his arm. Her fingers were trembling. Calvin looked at her hand for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and buttoned the bottom button the way his father had taught him. He said only one more thing. He said his father had known exactly what kind of people the Beaumonts were. He said Henry had just wanted Calvin to know it for himself, in his own time, the way a man should know things, by living through them and coming out the other side, still standing. He walked up the center aisle, and he did not look back. Bernard Beaumont did not move. He sat in the pew across the aisle like a man from whom something essential had been removed, staring at the pulpit where Pastor Gideon had delivered Henry Reeves's eulogy, and he did not say a word. Simone sat in the front pew of 3rd Ward Missionary Baptist Church, the church she had never once entered for the man who had built the empire that had just dismantled hers, and she sat there alone. The heavy wooden door swung closed behind Calvin. The sound of it echoed through the empty sanctuary like the last word in a very long conversation. 60 days after the church door closed, the legal proceedings concluded. The Beaumont Group's final accounting came in the form of numbers that did not lie and could not be negotiated with. 14 of the original 23 locations remained. 7 had been sold at distressed prices in the 90-day window, generating enough to cover the called note, but not enough to leave the business unscathed. 2 more locations closed in the weeks after, unable to sustain operations without the corporate infrastructure that the financial pressure had gutted. The empire Bernard Beaumont had spent 30 years building was now 9 locations, and a reputation that the Houston charity circuit had already quietly revised its opinion of. Bernard's personal assets took the remainder of the hit. The Sugarland house, the one with the water feature in the entryway that Calvin had always found faintly absurd, was refinanced at terms that left Bernard with considerably less equity than he had carried into the year. His investment accounts were partially liquidated to satisfy the personal guarantee exposure. The man who had told Calvin he was lucky, publicly and repeatedly, and with a smile that contained no warmth, now sat in a smaller version of the life he had built in a city that remembered his name but no longer returned his calls at the same speed. Gloria moved to Dallas in March. She had a sister there, a quieter life, a neighborhood where nobody knew the Beaumont name well enough to notice what it had lost. She packed her things with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime organizing other people's events and now found herself organizing her own departure. She did not call Calvin before she left. He did not expect her to. Simone's divorce settlement closed on a Tuesday. She received the marital home and a cash settlement that her attorney had fought hard to obtain, and that still came in at a fraction of what her initial filings had demanded. The posture reversal had been complete, and it had been permanent. Garrett, her attorney, did not return her calls after the case closed. She was left with a house, a diminished family name, and the specific silence of a social circle that had already begun the process of closing around the space she used to occupy. Calvin received the settlement notification by email. He read it, filed it, and opened the shop at 7 the following morning. The Henry Reeves Community Foundation was announced in April, 2 months after the divorce was finalized. $50 million, 3rd Ward, Houston. The endowment was structured to fund small business loans for neighborhood entrepreneurs, the kind of businesses that 3rd Ward had always produced and that had always been underserved by institutions that considered the zip code a liability. There was also a trade apprenticeship program, partnerships with 3 Houston high schools, and a dedicated track for HVAC training that Calvin had designed himself, drawing on 15 years of building his own business from a single van and a set of tools. The apprenticeship program was named the Henry Arthur Reeves Trade Fellowship. Calvin kept his shop, 12 employees, same location on Alameda, same hours, same truck. He did not move to a bigger house, he did not buy a new vehicle, he did not perform his wealth in any of the ways that wealth usually announces itself. What he did was show up the same as he always had, and let the work speak at the volume it had always spoken. There was a planning meeting for the foundation in late May, held in a conference room at 3rd Ward Missionary Baptist that Pastor Gideon had offered for the purpose. A woman arrived at 6:30 with 2 trays of food, baked chicken, cornbread, a pot of greens that smelled like somebody's grandmother had been involved, and set them on the side table without being asked and without making a production of it. Her name was Diane Collier. She ran a catering operation out of 3rd Ward, school lunches and church repasts and community events, a business she had built herself the same way Calvin had built his, one contract at a time, one early morning at a time. She set the food down, looked around the room to make sure it was situated correctly, and then noticed Calvin standing near the window reviewing a document. She asked him directly and without preamble if the fellowship program was named for his father. Calvin said it was. She asked what kind of man Henry Reeves had been. Calvin told her. He told her in the unhurried way he talked about things that mattered, and Diane Collier listened the way people listen when they are actually listening and not simply waiting for their turn to speak. When he finished, she did not rush to fill the space. She let the silence sit there the way it deserved to sit. And then she said that Henry sounded like a man who understood what things were actually for. Calvin looked at her for a moment. He said he thought that was exactly right. That was the whole exchange. There was a room full of people and a meeting to run and food getting cold on the side table. But Calvin thought about that exchange later, driving home, and he thought that it was the first time in a long time that someone had asked him something real and listened to the full answer. He visited his father's grave on a Sunday morning in June, alone, in the early quiet before the city warmed up. He stood in front of the headstone with his hands in his pockets and his truck keys in his fist, and he stood there long enough to say what needed to be said without words, the way his father had taught him that the most important things are said. Henry Reeves had not hidden his money to protect it. He had hidden it to protect his son, to make sure that when the world tried to tell Calvin who he was, Calvin already knew. To make sure that no amount of contempt or condescension or open doors on the shoulder of a Houston highway could reach the place where Calvin's sense of himself lived. Henry had built the wall not of money, but of character, and he had built it deliberately and in advance, the way a good father builds things. Calvin drove home through Third Ward as the afternoon light went gold and long across the neighborhood. He had the windows down. The radio was on low, gospel bleeding into the early evening air, the way it always did on Sunday on these streets. He passed the barber shop on Dowling where his father used to get his hair cut every 2 weeks for 40 years. He passed the church. He passed the block where he had grown up, the small houses, sitting neat and well kept in the early summer heat, porch lights already coming on. He drove through it all at the speed of someone who is not rushing to get somewhere, because they are already exactly where they are supposed to be. Now, if you have made it to the end of this story, I want to ask you something. What would you have done in Calvin's position when you found out the truth, when you held all the cards? Would you have made the same choice? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because I read every single one of them, and this community has things to say that are worth hearing. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, tap that like button before you go. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach more people who need a story like this one today. And if you are not subscribed yet, join this community. There is another story coming that you will not want to miss. I will see you in the next one.